Though the stories that come out of war are largely tragic, violent, and graphic, many miraculous and humorous events also take place that lifts the spirits of all of us to see how interesting and funny life can be despite the struggles. Today's story comes from a chapter out of John Peace's best-selling book, A Boy from Cracker's Neck, titled The Americans Are Coming. Now, in a previous episode, we talked about the dangers of certain positions in the bomber crew, with the ball turret gunner being the most dangerous. And in this chapter, Smitty, the ball turret gunner for Little Helen, actually got stuck in the in his position. So let me start by reading just the first little bit from this chapter. It says, "Get the damn landing gear down now," yelled Bob over the intercom. While Jimmy and Bob were struggling to hold the yoke back, both men's arms were shaking. "We're working on it," Isaac yelled back. "What about getting Smitty out of that damn ball turret?" "He'll get crushed if we belly land without the landing gear," Tex yelled. Not only were the main hydraulics shot out that operated the landing gear, the lack of hydraulic pressure had locked up the belly ball turret gun with Smitty in it. It wouldn't swivel around to allow the hatch to open to exit the turret into the main fuselage. So this was kind of like the two worst things that could have happened, especially to a ball turret gunner. The landing gear is gone. So if they
Mm-hmm.
don't get it down and they hit the ground, he is just going to be smeared across the pavement. And he was stuck. So,
Yes.
so what happened?
Well, let me go ahead. I'm going to finish up right
Good.
there. The fuselage of the Little Helen was cramped and filled with a maze of wires and piping that snaked their way through. The floor was now littered with spent ammunition castings, tools, and bits of shrapnel that flew around the aircraft during the intense barrage of enemy fire. The heat was unbearable, and sweat poured down the crew's faces, mingling with the soot and grime. The air was thick with acid smoke, which made it nearly impossible to see anything beyond the flickering red glow of the instruments. The pungent smell of burning oil and metal permeated the air along with the metallic tang of fear. Despite the chaos, crew worked with fierce determination, sweat pouring from their brows, and they desperately tried to repair the damage to save their own lives. I had the privilege of actually going onto a B 17 bomber. Our local airport had brought one in that tours. And one thing that amazed me, see, I'm 6'1". My granddad was probably 5'9", 5'10". How cramped. This was a big plane,
Wow.
but where the men were at, it was cramped.
Now, how big
Because
was Smitty? He was pretty tiny, wasn't he?
oh no, he was tiny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because in the bomber
And
crew pictures, he's little, and
yes.
5'9", 5'10" is actually by today's standards not that tall. Whereas
No,
Smitty
but
was
back then that
made
was
them look
considered
taller,
cramped.
I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's actually some pictures of Papa at the rest home with Smitty beside him, and Smitty looked like almost a child,
Yeah.
and he was very small. And but the fuselage was the whole plane was big, but it was all wings, and it was all for the bombs.
Mm-hmm.
They left very little room for the crew, and that wasn't really a consideration. So when you talk about being in this cramped space, and one thing that my granddad always talked about the whole war, you were either freezing to death or you were burning up, because
Mm.
at high altitude they were freezing to death. It was below zero. And then in this case, in this particular story, they'd gone down low trying to get warm air. And so they were burning up in all this, the leather and the fur lined jackets. And they had the electric long johns that were heated. So, they're trying to strip clothes, trying to get, the landing gear down. And you can imagine the chaos inside, smoke everywhere. And you can imagine the smell. If anybody's ever smelled like burning electrical, like a burned electrical cord, it's a terrible
Mm.
pungent smell
I like that.
and
You're kind of giving
burns
us
your eyes.
the visual and the sense of this scene that they were
Yes.
living through. Yeah.
And I can remember the first time I watched Memphis Belle, and they have a similar scene, not quite the same, but a similar scene trying to get the landing gear down. First thing I thought was they stole my granddad's story, but actually it happened, I wouldn't say on a regular basis, but it wasn't uncommon. And that's the reason why they had the emergency cranks to get the landing gear down and all that. And, they had prepared, they knew that this situation could happen to ball turret gunners. And evidently it happened, and they'd had some bad cases of people getting killed because they knew what was going
They'd
on or
seen
what
what could
could happen.
happen if they
Yeah.
didn't get that fixed
Yeah.
in time. Yeah.
And unlike,
Mm.
earlier, there's another story about the bomb that gets stuck. They could bail out over the ocean and hopefully get picked up. Well, they couldn't do that with Smitty trapped in there. You
They didn't
couldn't
want to
bail
leave
out.
him. Yeah.
No. So that wasn't the
Yeah.
option. The only option was try to get that landing gear down and then hope it stayed down. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So they are flying along, and then they find out that they are being that trying to land at their normal base wasn't going to be possible because it was fogged in, Bury St. Edmunds,
Mhm.
and so they were redirected to the Royal Air Force Base at Mildenhall. Um, and all this time, they don't know, right? They don't know if the landing
No.
gear is down. All they know is that, well, now we got to go somewhere else. So there's a little bit more time for Smitty to be down there wondering if he's going to
Yeah.
live or die.
I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know
Yeah.
whether you'd want to know sooner or later. That's a terrible predicament to be in. Yeah.
So they're redirected. They land at what's essentially a British Air Force base. So Bray St. Edmunds was largely U.S. Air Force, and this
Yes.
was a British base. And so they arrive, and they go, and they're hungry. They've been flying and they've been stressed. Well, actually, back up.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
happened to the landing gear? I guess I kind of gave it away at the beginning. I said it's a Hollywood ending. So what happens
Okay.
when they landed?
Well, and they hear the wheel screech. Let me pronounce it correctly and stuff.
Screech.
And
I like
we've
it.
all, if you've flown on an airplane and you land, you know that sound,
Mm-hmm.
and that's actually a good sound.
Mm-hmm.
And so that
Means
happens,
you
and
have some wheels on the ground. So yeah.
yes, and the plane doesn't, collapse onto the tarmac onto the runway. So you got this huge relief. And one thing I was going to back up a little bit that I probably didn't put enough story or enough into my stories was how much the weather played
Mm.
into their bombing missions.
Yeah.
There was a lot of planes that they lost just due to weather
Oh, they
and
actually
weather
lost
related
because they
crashes.
couldn't come and land, and if
Yes,
that was
getting
fogged in.
fogged out, and you can imagine like this case. Most of their instruments were down. They were just flying,
Mm-hmm.
without instrumentation. And you can imagine it. Let's say you got caught in the fog. I mean, just to find your air base was something. And so
Yeah.
and then we go back to 1943. We take for granted we kind of know what the weather's going to do, and it actually surprises us if it surprises us. Back then, it was so primitive on their weather predictions, and so many times they'd get ready for a mission and then it'd get scrapped because of weather.
Yeah. So they get all hyped up, and then they know they're
Hmm.
still going to fly it though. So
Yeah.
it's nothing more than being delayed and added stress. You can just imagine. But Smitty got to live, and they were celebrating.
Yes.
um, and they landed a British base. They're starving, and just to read from your book, this is where it gets really entertaining. It says that the crew of Little Helen had no idea that even in wartime, dinner was a formal affair for the British.
Hmm.
Back at the American base, when crews landed, they would often grab meals at the mess hall wearing their flight suits and sidearms straight off the plane. It was no big deal to eat first and then go shower for the night. Brits did the exact opposite. British bomber crews would immediately shower and change into formal dress uniforms before stepping foot into a dining hall, while American crews might go weeks or months and not touch their dress uniforms. Only for visits by high ranking military brass or the press would they get dressed up. So this
Yeah.
this difference creates for a very funny scene that I hope that you'll share.
Yeah, and my granddad was talking about the only time they would wear their dress uniforms was when they left the base, and that
Mm.
was, or if there was top brass coming in, they put on their dress uniforms, but it was really not used very much. So I'll finish up your scene. When Jimmy and the crew stepped into the dining hall, the whole place got quiet with tables and tables of British in their fine dress uniforms staring right at them. What they saw was 10 men, dirty and gritty from head to toe, in filthy flight uniforms. All but Jimmy had a shoulder harness carrying the famous American Colt 45 under their arms. Hell, Tex even had a double holster carrying two Colt 45s, one being the gift from Jimmy had blessed him with. The nearest British officer, and seeing him, you can imagine him just looking at him. Watch out, boys. The Americans are coming, like cowboys off a cattle drive with their six shooters. Laughter erupted, and as my granddad would point out, English food was terrible. And I've never been to England. I hope one day I do go. But the one thing you know about England, nobody talks about them having great food. So
Yeah.
so I always thought that was funny. My granddad, he'd always finish that story talking about how terrible their mess hall was
Like,
compared to the American mess hall. Um,
that's the thing that stood out to him. And I think that's funny too, because they get so dressed up all formal to go eat crappy food,
yeah,
So
I
I
guess
guess
it
they
made
had
it
to
taste
make it
better. I
good
don't know.
somehow.
Yeah, made it taste better. But it was just, just showed the difference, and the British with their pomp and circumstance, and even in the military in wartime, they still kind of held true to those traditions. And here comes the Americans, the cowboys,
The
and
cowboys
Granddad
just
was talking. Yeah, I mean that's
like they'd
what
just been
British.
out wrestling cattle, got off their,
Yeah,
came
they were
screeching
pretty
across the
famous.
runway and walked right
Hmm.
in.
Yeah,
Like they owned the place, I'm sure. That's a little
and
swashbuckling
also
going on.
also carrying the sidearms.
Yeah,
The
carrying their
British
sidearms,
military.
which
Yeah, here comes the Americans with their guns. So anyway, that was one funny story he'd always talk about. He'd giggle about. As you can tell, probably some of the stories, Smitty was very close. He felt very close to Smitty. He was like a little buddy to
yeah.
him because Papa was at 5'10" back in that era, was considered a pretty tall fella and pretty big. And Smitty was so little. He was a
Yeah.
little fella. So, but everybody survived their mission.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that we got to have a really positive, even though it had moments of tension, but a real positive story to see that not end badly for Smitty, and then just
Mhm.
kind of walk in and own the place, as dirty as they were. But yeah, there's a lot more good stories to come. But that's a
Well,
that's a
thank
nice
you.
one
Thank you
after
for
a couple of
having me.
dark episodes. So. Well, we hope that you're enjoying this channel and the stories being shared by the authors who take the time to preserve the stories and those events in life that shouldn't be forgotten. And the truth is, we all have those experiences. So I encourage you to be inspired by the interviews you're watching and consider preserving the stories in your life that can strengthen and uplift others. Keep watching for more great stories. We'll definitely have more coming from John, and listen for some sound advice on how to write and publish your own book, because I'll be sharing a lot of those types of videos as well. So I invite you to follow and participate in this Triumph community by subscribing to Triumph Talks, and consider leaving a comment, because we would love to hear from you and what you think of these stories as well. Thanks, John, for being on again.
Thank you for having me.